Everyone thought it would be an ordinary service, the kind people attend out of routine rather than expectation. But something about the air inside the church felt different that morning. Heavier, almost charged, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something no one could yet name. It all began with laughter. Not joy, not warmth, but a sharp, careless laugh that cut through the quiet just as the choir lifted their voices. Their harmonies were soft but sincere, filling the space with a gentle reverence that had taken weeks of practice and years of devotion to shape. And that was when the man spoke, loud enough for several rows to hear. His tone dripped with mockery as he shook his head and muttered about how off-key they sounded. How embarrassing it was, how people like them should never be allowed to sing in public. A few nearby turned to look at him, stunned not only by his words, but by the confidence with which he delivered them, as if cruelty were something to be proud of. Though some tried to ignore him, the damage had already been done. The choir heard it, every word, every sneer. For a brief moment their voices faltered, not because they lacked skill, but because humiliation has a way of tightening the chest and stealing the breath, especially when it comes unexpectedly. The man, sensing the power he now held, leaned into it. He rolled his eyes, whispering again, louder this time, saying the singing sounded like noise, not music, and that silence would be a blessing. A few uncomfortable chuckles followed, not from agreement, but from people unsure how to react when cruelty walks openly into a sacred place. The choir director noticed immediately. Her hands trembled slightly as she tried to keep time, her eyes scanning the faces of her singers, some young, some old, all now bound by the same quiet pain. And that was when something shifted. Because instead of stopping, instead of retreating, the choir kept going. Their voices grew steadier, stronger, as if something deep inside them had awakened, something that refused to be silenced by mockery. The man scoffed again, crossing his arms, whispering to the person beside him that this was painful to endure. And yet, one by one, people began to notice the sound changing. It wasn't becoming louder, but fuller, richer, layered with an emotion that no rehearsal could ever teach. Because this was no longer about notes or timing. It was about dignity, about standing firm when someone tries to make you feel small. The music began to wrap itself around the room in a way that made even the most distracted listener look up. Something honest was happening, something raw and unpolished and therefore powerful. The man's smirk slowly faded as heads turned away from him and toward the choir. For the first time since he had spoken, he felt something unfamiliar. Not anger, not amusement, but discomfort. Mockery loses its power when it is ignored. Yet the true turning point came when the youngest member of the choir, a boy no older than 12, stepped forward slightly without being told. His voice was clear, but trembling, not perfect, but brave, carrying a line that seemed to float above the rest. The church grew quieter, not out of command, but out of instinct, as people realized they were witnessing something fragile and extraordinary. The man opened his mouth to say something else, another joke, another cutting remark, but the sound never came, because the boy's voice reached something buried deep inside the room, something that reminded everyone present why they had come in the first place. One by one, the laughter died, the whispers stopped, and even the man who had mocked them found himself frozen, staring forward as the weight of what he had done began to settle. This was no longer entertainment. It was a mirror, reflecting how easily cruelty can walk into a holy space and how unexpectedly truth can rise to meet it. As the final note hung in the air, unbroken and pure, no one clapped, no one spoke. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full, heavy with realization. The man finally lowered his gaze, his earlier confidence replaced by something close to shame. No one pointed at him, no one scolded him, because the moment itself had done all the speaking that was needed. The silence that followed did not break quickly. It lingered like a held breath. As people slowly shifted in their seats, the priest at the altar looked up, his expression no longer focused on the order of the service, but on the faces before him. He could feel it, that subtle but unmistakable change in the room. The man who had mocked the choir now felt every eye, not judging him directly, but passing over him as if he no longer mattered. That realization hurt more than any confrontation ever could. Being ignored after causing harm forces a person to sit alone with their own actions. As the choir director lowered her hands, her voice barely steady, she whispered for the singers to remain standing. She knew this moment was not finished. The boy who had stepped forward stood frozen, his heart pounding. He glanced up and saw faces softened with tears, heads bowed not in shame but in reflection. A quiet strength he didn't know he possessed bloomed in his chest. The priest slowly stepped away from the altar, his eyes fixed on the boy. When he spoke, his voice carried easily through the room, steady and clear. He said that sometimes the most important moments are not planned, that sometimes truth interrupts routine because it must be heard. The man who had mocked the choir felt those words land like stones. The priest invited the boy forward, not to perform again, but simply to stand, to be seen. The boy hesitated, then looked to the choir director, who nodded gently, her eyes shining with pride. As the boy stepped out, the man shifted uncomfortably, memories stirring of being young, of being laughed at, of using mockery later in life as armor to keep from ever feeling that small again. The priest placed a hand on the boy's shoulder and spoke about courage, about how faith is not perfection but willingness. He spoke of how bravery often sounds shaky at first, and how those who mock what they do not understand often fear something within themselves. Though the priest never looked directly at the man, every word seemed to travel straight to him, stripping away the casual cruelty he had worn so easily minutes before. The priest then asked the choir to sing once more, not to prove anything, but simply as an offering. This time when they sang, there was no hesitation, no wavering. The sound that rose was not flawless, but it was honest, layered with relief, resilience, and something close to joy. The man felt his throat tighten. For the first time in a long while, he felt small, in a way that did not provoke anger, but humility. When the service ended, the man lingered in his seat. Finally, he rose and walked toward the choir, his steps slow, uncertain. When he reached the boy, he stopped, cleared his throat, and apologized. Not loudly, but sincerely. He admitted his words had been wrong, that they came from a place of bitterness, and that hearing the boy sing had reminded him of something he thought he had lost. The boy listened quietly, then nodded, accepting the apology without triumph, without judgment. Sometimes forgiveness does not need ceremony either. As the man walked away, lighter than when he had arrived, the choir gathered around the boy, not praising him as a hero, but thanking him for his courage. That day spread quietly beyond the church walls, not as gossip, but as a reminder that even a single voice, mocked and doubted, can change the atmosphere of an entire room. After that Sunday, the church never quite felt the same. Not because something was broken, but because something had been uncovered. People carried it with them into the week, replaying the moment in their minds while washing dishes, driving to work, lying awake at night. They wondered why a simple act of mockery had shaken them so deeply. The man who had laughed found himself returning to that memory again and again, hearing his own voice echo back at him in a way that made his chest tighten. Now that the moment had passed, he could no longer hide behind humor or impatience. He began to notice how often he spoke without care, how easily he dismissed things that did not impress him, how often he used sarcasm to shield himself from feeling exposed. Meanwhile, the boy returned to school. His classmates who had been at the service looked at him differently, not with praise that embarrassed him, but with a quiet respect that made him walk a little straighter. He still doubted himself, still wondered if his voice truly mattered, or if it had only mattered because of the situation. The choir director found herself receiving messages from people she hadn't heard from in years, former members, visitors, even strangers. They all said the same thing in different words, that something about that song had reached them in a way sermons sometimes did not. She realized then that music had always been more than sound. It had been a bridge, and sometimes bridges are tested by those who try to shake them. The priest, too, reflected deeply on that day. He recognized that leadership isn't always about control, but about discernment, about knowing when to step back and let truth unfold on its own. The story slowly spread beyond that single congregation, not as gossip, but as a quiet testimony passed from one person to another. Weeks later, during another service, a woman stood to speak during an open reflection. Her voice trembled as she admitted that she had almost stopped coming to church because she felt unseen, unworthy. But watching the boy sing, despite being mocked, reminded her that faith is not about approval, it is about showing up anyway. Others followed, one by one, sharing how the moment had stirred something unresolved in them: regrets, fears, buried hopes. The man who had mocked the choir attended these gatherings quietly, sitting near the back, listening, absorbing, changing slowly, in ways no one announced but many sensed. One evening, he stayed behind after everyone left, approaching the priest, not with excuses, but with questions. He asked why the moment affected him so deeply, why he felt stripped of something he didn't realize he depended on. The priest listened, then answered simply that humility often arrives disguised as discomfort, and growth rarely feels flattering. Those words stayed with the man as he began making small changes. He started speaking less, listening more, catching himself before dismissing others. Though no one crowned him as redeemed, the transformation was real. The boy continued singing, not as a symbol, not as a miracle, but as a young person discovering that courage does not remove fear, it moves forward with it. Months later, during a community event, the choir performed again. This time, the man sat in the front row, applauding softly, tears in his eyes. Not because the singing was perfect, but because he understood now what he had almost crushed. People who heard the story online or through word of mouth began sharing their own versions, moments when someone mocked their faith, their passion, their voice, and how close they came to silence. If you are listening to this and feel that familiar tightening in your chest, that fear of being laughed at for what matters to you, remember this story. Remember that one voice, even when mocked, can shift an entire room. If this moment resonates with you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it, comment your thoughts, and ask yourself honestly, when was the last time you chose courage over silence? As time went on, the moment stopped being remembered as an incident and started being remembered as a turning point. The people who had been there carried it into new spaces and new conversations. The church slowly became known not for perfection, but for honesty, for being a place where people could bring their fragile voices without fear of being crushed. The boy grew older, his voice changing as voices do, cracking at times, deepening at others. Each change reminded him of that day when he learned that worth is not measured by how polished you sound, but by how true you are willing to be. There were days he doubted again, days when he remembered the laughter more than the silence that followed it, days when insecurity crept back in quietly. But each time he stepped up to sing, he remembered the faces in that room, the way the air had shifted, the way even mockery had been forced to retreat in the presence of sincerity. The choir itself evolved, welcoming new members who had heard the story and felt encouraged to try. People who said they could not sing but wanted to learn. People who had been told they were not good enough elsewhere. The director led them patiently, reminding them that voices grow when they are nurtured, not when they are shamed. The priest began weaving the lesson into sermons without ever naming the man or the moment. He spoke instead about how quickly words can wound and how slowly healing takes. The man who had once mocked now volunteered, quietly stacking chairs, helping clean, sitting with people who needed someone to listen. He never announced his change, never asked to be forgiven publicly, because the truest transformation often happens without an audience. One evening, he encountered someone new who scoffed during rehearsal, not cruelly but dismissively. He felt the old reflex rise in him, the urge to agree, to laugh, to bond through mockery. But instead, he spoke gently, saying that every voice matters more than it seems. He surprised himself with how natural the words felt. That was when he knew the moment had truly changed him. Not because he felt shame anymore, but because he felt responsibility. The story continued to ripple outward, reaching people who had never set foot in that church. People who watched or listened from afar and recognized themselves in different roles. Some as the mocked, some as the silent witnesses, some as the mockers who had never considered the weight of their words. Each person carried away a different lesson, but the same quiet challenge: to pause before laughing, to listen before dismissing, to choose empathy even when it feels uncomfortable. If you find yourself reflected in this story, whether in the boy's trembling courage or the man's hard-earned humility, remember that moments like these are always happening around us, often unnoticed, waiting for someone to respond differently. If this story stirred something in you, share it with someone who needs it. Speak up where kindness is needed, and let this be a reminder that even a single moment of courage can echo far beyond the room where it began. Thank you for listening. Please subscribe for more stories like this.